useful setup for the Last Supper and the farewell discourses. There's a lot here, and I'm covering a good deal of territory, and I'm sure there'll be questions asked. I'm not going to be able to go into detail in a lot of these things. We'll pick out some important highlights in these passages that I hope will give you a framework for reading and understanding them as you go forward. So first of all, a little bit of an overview of what we get in the Last Supper and the farewell discourses. In terms of structure, I've been big on the notion that John likes diptychs, likes balanced pericopes that interact with one another in interesting ways. There's a bit of a shift that takes place in the second half of the gospel, and John, or the Johannine editors, if we have more than one, seem to begin to favor more of a chiastic or ring composition. That is, a series of episodes where the first somehow corresponds to the last, and they all frame some central episode. This notion of a ring composition is found in ancient rhetoric or applications of modern categories of study of structure to ancient rhetoric. It's there all over the place. It's there in ancient rhetoric because of the ways in which ancient orators had to memorize what they were up to and the speeches that they were going to give, and they organized their speeches by framing them in terms of architectural structures that usually have some sort of arc-like frame and center on things. So it's not surprising that people who are in touch with ancient rhetorical or literary devices get into ring compositions in one way or another, or chiastic compositions. Chiasm is the Greek term coming from the letter chi, has an X, and if you look at the way in which a ring composition can be framed, it looks like part of an X. So what we have here, I think in chapter 13 is a nice little diptych. We have the foot washing at supper scene, followed by discussion about the betrayer. And those two neatly balance one another. Then we have the farewell discourse that begins on the note of glorification. Glory is big throughout these chapters. And the love command. The love command. Which is the point at which glory is revealed and is the vehicle through which glory is revealed. And that begins in chapter 13, 31 and following. Then there's a dialogue between Jesus and the disciples that runs from the end of chapter 13 through the end of chapter 14. And in this part of the dialogue, we encounter for the first time the figure of the Paraclete. We're going to have to spend a little bit of time on that figure. And at the end of chapter 14, we have Jesus saying to the disciples, okay, let's go. Time's up, which has suggested to lots of people that the farewell discourse originally ended there and was supplemented by the material that follows in chapters 15, 16, and 17. That may be so. But in any case, the addition of the material is by someone who has the same theological bent as the person who's put everything else together and is working with the same set of presuppositions, maybe with a little tweaking. So it could be the same person who has decided he needs to balance something that he said before. In any case, what happens is the creation of a nice ring that focuses on an image, a pair of images, or an image and a command, the image of the true vine, and discussion of the love command again. So a diptych right in the center of this ring that's followed by more dialogue with the disciples in chapters 15 and 16, although the dialogue is not quite as intense as it is in chapters 13 and 14. And another comment on the Paraclete and the relationship between these two sets of comments on the Paraclete is one of the things that leads many people to think, oh, maybe we have a new editor or the author rethinking some of his material from before. And then finally, we have the prayer for unity, the so-called high priestly prayer in chapter 17. So that's the overall shape of things. And I think it's useful to keep that in mind as you're reading through this material. The stuff that we're dealing with here in chapters 13 through 17 has different literary connections and evokes different kinds of literary forms. Initially, and in the dialogue materials of the Farewell Discourse, it invokes the conventions of symposia, that is, accounts of dinner parties and conversations over heady matters that goes back to Plato and Xenophon and continues down through antiquity. Plutarch, roughly contemporary with the Fourth Gospel, does a symposium. And then the category is picked up by early Christians. We have in the 3rd century a bishop named Methodius of Olympus, who does a symposium of virgins, talking about their virginity. Love is a big theme in a lot of these symposia because it's there in the archetype of symposia, Plato's symposia, where the issue on the table is, what is love? And all of the people who are engaged in conversation there give a perspective on love from their own professional point of view, be it a philosopher, a dramatist, a doctor, who knows what, or a prophetess who gives the deciding voice to what true love is all about there, diotima. In any case, there's a convention of having dinner parties where love is on the table and different points are made about what love is. In Plato, it's all about the relationship between man-boy, pederastic love, and the kind of love that Plato wants to advocate, Platonic love, which is creating beauty in the minds or souls of the beloved, different from the loving that goes on in a lot of the other speeches of that symposia. And this goes all the way to Methodius of Olympus, who talks about the love of virgins for virginity and celibacy. So love can be framed in different ways. But love is often a topic of symposia. Another literary form that John is calling upon and using here is the form of a testament. That is what someone says just before he or she departs from life. And some of the same plays on temporal categories that we find in the Last Supper discourse here are also found in testaments. Deuteronomy is in some ways a testament, and the form of testament became very widespread in Jewish literature of the Second Temple period. We have testaments of the 12 patriarchs, testament of Moses, testament of Job, and several others. John 15 and 16 in particular, I think the latter part of this whole business comes closest to the testamentary genre. And then there's at least a connection with a theme that runs through consolation literature. That is literature that largely philosophers write to people who have lost a loved one, to a wife or some other person who has lost a member of the family. And a philosopher will say, relax, it's not the end, or there's a better hope for the person, or we all have this to worry about. Yes, but there's immortality. So, there are all sorts of ways in which one can offer consolation. But that too is an element of the literary tradition that John is weaving in. So all of these things get combined into the story of the Last Supper and Jesus's last discourse. The Last Supper is a meal before Passover, so not a Passover Seder, can't be, because the Passover lambs are being slain on Good Friday. So it's a different kind of meal from what we're used to seeing in the Synoptic Gospels. And there's no broken bread or wine used as a symbol of blood, all of which are issues that seem to have been dealt with back there in chapter 6. And we talked when we did our analysis of that chapter about how those Eucharistic elements, if we can call them that, work there. And because they're working there, the evangelist doesn't have to worry about them here. He has other things that he wants to put on the table, namely the foot washing. an act which he says is a necessary, says to Peter, Jesus says to Peter, is a necessary condition of fellowship with him. Is this an allusion to some sort of ritual that's a necessary condition for membership in the community? An allusion to baptism? Does foot washing simply serve as a symbol of baptism? Or is it something else? Well, Jesus gives an interpretation of the action and describes the action as an example, a hupodegma, an example of humble service. And that, it would seem, is what it is to be the necessary condition of relationship to God through Christ, the acceptance of humble service as the essence of what God is asking one to do. The foot washing then is a very important sign, if you will, in the fullest sense of what sign means for the evangelist. That is, it's something that conveys meaning at a deep level, and one has to push to get that meaning. But at the same time, the meaning is right there if you look at it and see what's going on. This is probably, in fact, a dramatic interpretation of a saying that we find in one form or another elsewhere in the gospel tradition, either the saying about the Son of Man coming to serve and not be served that we get in Mark 10:45, or Luke 22:26 saying, the one who serves is greater than the master. And since Jesus has used the master-servant language here, it may well be that that's the form of the saying that's most relevant to the dramatic instantiation of the theme that we get here. The action, in any case, anticipates the command to love that Jesus gives in 13:34, that love command that will reverberate in the later chapters of the farewell discourse. And all of that, the action of Jesus and the love command and its reverberation, provides the interpretation for the coming passion and provides the substance of what the glorification is. That is, the revelation of self-giving love is what the death, but the life and death and coming again of Jesus is all about, whenever that coming occurs. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that in a minute. So this chapter is, I think, very important for setting up what John is trying to do in the gospel as a whole, that is, offer an interpretation of the life and death of Christ, focus on the love command that is the essence of the revelation of who God is. After that episode, then we have the discussion of the betrayal, which echoes synoptic materials. We can see how well, we have a balance here in the Johannine material between stuff that he's getting from other sources and inserting, reshaping a little bit, and stuff that he creates and shapes in a major way. In any case, the betrayal is something that we find in the synoptics, and it's all focused on Judas here. And that betrayal is taking place, is signified in terms of the symbol of darkness and light. The dramatic reference to it being night when Judas goes out signals that whole business. And it's interesting that Peter is also involved in the possibility of denial, anticipating what goes on in chapter 18, and his rehabilitation in chapter 21. So when thinking about reactions to Jesus and the way in which different characters exemplify reactions to Jesus, it's important to note, I think, how Peter functions in this text. John does not spend an awful lot of time on notions of reconciliation and forgiveness, as does Luke, but he has this important symbol of it, particularly in Peter. A little bit of comic relief, or maybe not so comic relief, as we're thinking about the foot washing. There are all sorts of portrayals of the foot washing. This is one by an artist, one of whose pieces I've shown before. That is the feeding piece that hangs in the refectory at Yale Divinity School. This piece by John August Swanson, another piece with the same kind of technique of layered colors, is a rendition of the foot washing. And there are several that he has, and some are much more conventional, where all of the characters have beards. Here they don't. The only one who has a beard is Jesus. And how many of them are there? There are 13. And are they guys or gals, one might ask? I think John August Swanson wants you to ask that question, and might want you to ask the question about who was there at the Last Supper and what kind of significance did that have for the future of ministry. In any case, one little interesting take on the Last Supper. The foot washing, of course, has become something of a sacramental, to use the technical Catholic term. That is symbolic action. That's not one of the 7 divinely ordained sacraments, but it does something similar. Other traditions, like the Mennonites, certainly make a big deal of the foot washing, and it's become common in Easter celebrations in many of our different denominations these days. Here is Pope Francis doing his version of the foot washing in a field just within the last couple of years.